All right, let's get started. So how's everybody doing? I'm Ken Cerini. I'm joined today by my partner, Matt Burke. We're here for the board training part 2. We did the first part of the board training on October 13th. And as I said, it's posted in the link there. So please feel free to watch it if you've missed it. So our last presentation, the part 1 on October 13th, we touched on a couple topics. We looked at an overview of the nonprofit sector. We looked at certain board responsibilities, how to build a stronger board and board structure. Today, we're going to be focusing on being proactive, strategic thinking. We'll be talking a little bit about succession planning, which I think is a big issue that's happening right now. We're seeing a lot where a lot of the clients that we work with are looking for new leadership and new board members. So I think that's an important piece of this. And then we're also going to be touching on managing risk. And then finally, our third part of this series is going to take place on January 19th, where we'll be talking a little bit about fiscal viability and looking at some of the fiscal information boards should be receiving, including budgets and everything else. And then also one of the other roles of the board in terms of raising funds and the board's role within that fundraising. So let's talk a little bit about strategic thinking. If we think about this, COVID-19 came along back in 2020, and it kind of put a monkey wrench in a whole lot of things. Everybody became very reactionary in terms of running the organization. I mean, there were new rules coming out, new regulations. You were finding ways to operate remotely. You were trying to upgrade technology. You were dealing with payroll issues and people out, people in. Switching gears, pivoting this, pivoting that. So you had all these issues that were coming up. And I think over the last 3 years, the nonprofit sector, and it's not just the nonprofit, even the for-profit sector, people got very reactionary in how they dealt with things. We kind of got into the mode of crisis management. And I think now that, I mean, COVID is still a thing. COVID's going to be a thing for, I guess, some period of time. But we're at a point now where we've learned to live with COVID. We've learned and created the systems behind operations in a COVID environment. We've gotten the technology down for the most part. So here we are now in a place where we need to go back to that strategic thinking. We need to once again start reevaluating our organization and what we do and how we do things. And kind of thinking through processes and everything else. So again, that's where kind of we want you to start thinking through here and some of what the board needs to. I mean, the board, part of a main goal of a board of directors is to provide that strategic direction for the organization. And again, I think it's something that's been lacking over the last few years. So again, I don't know when the last time your organization has gone through a strategic planning process. But again, it's something that should happen once every couple of years in terms of a formalized strategic planning. And then it also needs to really be dynamic and built into the DNA of every board meeting. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So when you do strategic planning, most strategic planning sessions start with a SWOT analysis, where you're looking at your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats. And when you do that, you need to kind of consider that from both internal and external factors, because threats come both from internal loss of staff and things like that, as well as from external factors. You have opportunities based upon your leadership and management and everything else. You have weaknesses, again, which could be something similar to that. So you kind of have to go through the process to understand where you are as an organization first. And once you understand where you are as an organization, then you can really understand better the direction you want to move in. So within that strategic planning process, it's really important to understand your mission, your vision, and your values. Well, your mission is your organizational purpose. Why are you in business? What are you in business for? Your vision is insight into what the organization hopes to accomplish or become in the future. So in the long range, this is what our vision is, where we're looking to go, what we're looking to do. And values are our core principles and ethics. So, over time, organizations can sometimes see changes in how they operate. They could see changes in mission and everything else. So it's really important to reevaluate on a regular basis. What is our mission? Are we still relevant as an organization? Do we need to change factors that we're doing? Does the organization's operations align with the overall mission and vision of the organization? So that's a process that you need to go through as a board to determine that you are doing what you should be doing, that things are in alignment, that you haven't had mission creep where maybe you've chased dollars and now you're operating a little bit differently. As part of the process, once you kind of evaluate and determine what your mission really needs to be and whether you're still on track with your mission, then you need to really identify what your goals are. What are we trying to accomplish? Is it growth? Is it realignment of where we position? Is it bringing on new technology? What are the goals that we're trying to accomplish that are going to help us to reach that vision statement that we've created and help us to better operate within the mission that we've identified? And those goals need to be measurable. Things like, hey, we want to grow by 20%, or we want to expand our school capacity by adding 4 new classrooms. So again, you need to commit to measurable goals, and you need to develop systems in order to measure not just the goals themselves, but the impact that you're having with respect to those goals. You need to prioritize which are going to be the goals that are going to be the most important for your organization. Which are the goals that are least important, and you need to kind of rank them, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple seconds. You need to assign responsibilities and establish appropriate timeframes. Who's going to be responsible? Is it going to be a committee? Is it going to be an individual? Who's going to be assigned responsibility for each of the goals that are there? And what are the timeframes? Are we looking at a short-term time horizon? Are we looking at a long-term time horizon? How do you define success? How do you know when a goal has been achieved? And then implementing a monitoring system, kind of like a strategic planning scorecard. And what we've done with a lot of our clients is they've set up Excel spreadsheets, and within that Excel spreadsheet, they've outlined, what that goal is, what's the importance of the goal, and this goes back to that time horizon and prioritization. Is it a high goal, moderate, or low in terms of importance? Who's the responsible party or parties? What's the time frame? All spelled out on the spreadsheet. Again, within the spreadsheet, how do you define success? What's the status of the goal and the accomplishments? And what are the open issues, or what's the discussion that needs to still take place? And by having this spreadsheet, almost like this little scorecard or report card, what it enables you to do, it enables you to kind of look at this in a capsulated format and really gain a good understanding of whether you're achieving your goals, whether you're moving the strategic plan along. We've seen too often that organizations they put together a strategic plan, and then that strategic plan gets just put on the side and they go on their merry way again. But that strategic plan needs to be dynamic. It can't be a static process. You need to continue to evolve and plan as you move along. So as you eliminate goals from the spreadsheet, you should be looking at, are there new goals that should be added onto that spreadsheet? So I think the importance of that spreadsheet is to provide the board with a really strong scorecard. Again, I think as part of that whole process, and when you're looking at your SWOT analysis and everything else, you also need to consider, where do you fit? What's your role in the sector? What's your role in the community? Are you an organization that's one of maybe 27 other organizations that are doing, some of the same type of work? What makes you unique? What makes you special? Are you a national organization or are you a local organization? Who are you competing with in the marketplace? Is it another nonprofit? Is it other nonprofits? Is it for-profit businesses? You really need to understand where you fit into the marketplace and where you fit into the community, and who you're serving, and really understand whether that aligns well with the mission that you've established, and whether or not you should be changing what that looks like. Is your mission or how you meet it still relevant? We've seen organizations where they've had to really redefine their mission because what they've established to begin with either wasn't relevant anymore, maybe it was too broad, and they needed to kind of bring it back down into something a little more finite, because they realized that, you know, they're going to be more of a community-based organization. And as I mentioned before, has your organization experienced mission creep? We see that happen a lot, where organizations chase dollars. A new grant comes out. That grant provides much needed funding. The organization goes after it. That mission expands a bit, and then that funding dries up. And now you're in a situation where you're funding a program that maybe isn't really core to your mission. So you really need to look at those operations that you have and really look to see, are they core, are they not core? And in order to kind of do this evaluation, and this is going to come down, and we'll talk about more on this on our part 3 of this, but it comes down to financial information. It comes down to having good information on a timely basis so that you as a board can make really strong and important decisions. You want to identify the organization's key growth areas, right? I mean, what are the key metrics that need to be tracked? If you're a school, I mean, obviously students, it's going to be very important for you to look at students, and maybe even students by grade, right? So if you're a high school and you deal with 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades, it might be important to understand, you know, how many students you have per grade, because if I'm in a situation where, you know, I've got a bunch of students who are in 12th grade that are going to be graduating, and I don't have a new set of freshmen coming in, you know, that could be creating a problem. So you want to be looking at, you know, what are your growth areas? What are the key metrics that you need to track? What are the things that are going to be driving results to your organization? How will growth be accomplished? You know, and that's going to come back to, you know, the definition of your goals. You know, once you identify what your goals are, you can then identify how those goals fit into your growth strategy. Are you looking for vertical growth, where you're going to be expanding to be able to provide all of the services a certain population needs within a community? Are you looking for horizontal growth, where maybe you're looking to expand your footprint? You know, and those are things that, you know, and you're going to be really, really particular in the service you provide. So those are things you got to kind of look at and really understand where your sweet spot is and how you function as an organization. What resources are available to you? You know, it's kind of hard to grow if you don't have the internal resources. So do you have the right staffing? Do you have the right management? Do you have the right funding? If you're going to be growing, do you have the ability to fund that growth over a period of time? Because you may not hit the volume levels that you need early on. How do you measure impact? I think that's a really important thing, because we're looking, and it goes hand in hand with the next one, measuring social return on investment. You know, donors are really, really interested in understanding, you know, what impact you're having as an organization. And yes, it's great to say I've provided so many units of service. I've done, you know, I help 3,000 people. We do 5,000 units of service. But in what way? How impactful is that service? I can provide 5,000 units of service, and it's very non-impactful services, or I could provide 100 units of service and I'm changing lives. So it's also going to be important to really understand both internally and to be able to express it. You know, what is your impact as an organization? How do you define impact? How do you measure impact? And I think that's a place where a lot of organizations kind of fall flat, being able to articulate their measurement of impact and being able to kind of push that information out. And, you know, that's what donors want to see today. Donors are looking to understand the impact that you're having as an organization. I'm a big baseball fan. So when, you know, when and I'm a big Met fan, so I'm constantly paying attention to what they're doing. And, you know, when you get down around end of July into August, and we reach the trading deadline each year, you're in a situation where teams are really trying to make a decision as to whether they're buyers or sellers. Where do they fit into the playoff picture, and are they going to make a run for it? You know, that's something I think that's important to nonprofit organizations too, in looking at where they fit into the overall landscape of the communities they serve, the people they serve, and how they can be more effective in providing those services. And in order to be effective, I think you're going to find that there needs to be a strategic process in looking at collaboration and partnerships. And that collaboration and partnership happens at multiple levels. That happens at the public-private sector. So you're dealing with how are we going to collaborate effectively with some of the governmental agencies that we work with. It's looking at how do we collaborate with for-profit businesses and generate key partnerships with for-profit businesses. And then also how do we collaborate or partner with other nonprofit organizations. And part of that is also looking at, and it's not an easy decision, it's not an easy discussion, but part of it's looking at, where do we fit into the scheme of things? Are we important? Are we not important? Do we have the financial resources that we need in order to be able to continue to move forward? Or would we be better off partnering or merging into another organization that can really provide us with the strength that we need in order to help us to grow and develop and provide more service in terms of all of this. So, when we're kind of looking at that process, are you a buyer or are you a seller? I think it's really, really important for nonprofit organizations to kind of make that part of the discussion that happens at board levels or during a strategic planning process. You want to be in a situation where you're coming from a position of strength. And if you're not doing well and you're kind of doing some budgeting and long-term planning, and you see that, over the next 10 years or 5 years, we're going to see a drop off in the volume that we're having, our money's starting to dry up, all of these things, you're in a process where, maybe it might make sense to start looking for a strategic partner. If you're looking at maybe leadership leaving, and Matt will be talking about succession planning in a little while, maybe you need to start thinking about, hey, if I can't get leadership, I don't have the back office functionality, is there a way I can collaborate or partner? So again, that's all part of that strategic process. And there's a couple things that are happening within the environment. You've got a big push or continued push towards managed care. Managed care is going to, for any of the organizations that are in the kind of the healthcare world, it's going to continue to find ways to squeeze organizations, continue to find ways to cut back in terms of the amount they pay out. And organizations are going to need to, again, prove that they are important to the continuum. In order to do that, they need to be larger and have a significant hold within a particular marketplace. They need to have a good understanding of the full continuum of healthcare and maybe find ways to cut costs either in their segment of that continuum or in segments around them where they can better control the flow. Let me give you an example. If I'm an organization that works with the IDD population and I'm working with adults with developmental disabilities, and typically that population utilizes emergency rooms at a higher percentage, if I can work with that population and get them going to more local clinics and stuff like that, which cuts down the cost of care, if I can work with them on improving their overall physical condition and stuff like that, where they maybe have less needs. Those are all things that are going to help lower the cost across the entire continuum. So even though maybe I can't because the fees that I need for care and everything are more quote unquote chronic, I might be able to cut down costs where people are entering into the marketplace, healthcare marketplace, to reduce the costs in other places to make me more relevant. So it's a matter of kind of looking at, how you can make a difference within the managed care continuum. And again, as I said before, size matters. Larger organizations have more leverage in conversations, whether it be with your funding sources, whether it be with, the managed care companies. And then in many instances, smaller companies may be better and more nimble within a community environment. So again, I think it's also important to understand what your goals are and what you're trying to accomplish in terms of that. We are seeing, as I said before, shrinking resources. Governments are cutting back. There's been a lot of money dropped into the marketplace over the last couple of years due to CARES Act funding. That money is drying up. We're expecting, come next year, when we get to the 2024 state budget, that there are going to be cutbacks. We're not going to be seeing the increases. And even if there aren't cutbacks, I'm not sure that funding increases are going to keep up with inflation. So there will be some shrinkage in resources. So that's all things that you kind of have to think about. Well, how do I become more strategic in my thought process? Do I start shedding maybe some services that are not core to my mission that maybe I'm losing money on? And do I set up linkage agreements with other nonprofit organizations to ensure that my consumers can still continue to receive those services? The other thing we're starting to see a push in is a whole concept of community-based funding. And what community-based funding is it's organizations, typically private foundations, large donors, or even governmental agencies that are trying to make an impact within a community. And the needs of that community are not going to be met by one organization. They're going to be met by a group of organizations working in a consortium. So they provide funding to the community, and they're looking for groups to come together and meet the overall goals of what that funding is for. So I think you're going to see more and more of that community-based funding coming into play. One of the other things that we're seeing more of is boards of directors that, they'll go through and they'll do their strategic planning, but in order to keep that strategic planning rolling, they'll dedicate a portion of the board meeting to a strategic discussion. So they'll find ways to shrink the time, other parts of that meeting through consent agendas and stuff like that, in order to develop some time to have a 15-20 minute, half-hour discussion about some strategic topic. And I think that's kind of important for boards to kind of keep that strategic thinking going. Again, as I said before, that is an extremely important part of the board process. And then finally, I think, when you look at the whole aspect of strategic thinking and being proactive and all this stuff, it also comes down to how do you differentiate your organization from the rest of the sector. There are so many nonprofit organizations out there. A lot of them are doing the same sort of things. How do you get your voice heard above all of the other voices? And it comes down, I think, to impact. It comes down to leverage. It comes down to your involvement and the impact you're having on the community you serve. What sort of innovation and leadership is in place? What's your social media and your messaging and branding, and how does that kind of all align? So again, there's a lot of thought process here, and I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but there's a lot of thought process here that has to go in, and I think it's going to be really important. And those organizations that actually can start moving from that crisis management mode, where I think a lot of organizations are today, into more of a strategic thought process, are the ones that are going to do well over the next couple of years. The economy is not going to get better over the next year or two. So it's really going to come down to making sure that you're looking at things effectively. Matt?
Thanks, Ken. I'll take it from here. So Ken's mentioning being strategic in your thinking, and succession planning falls right in line with that. What we're finding is that all too many organizations are reactive, as Ken said, and not proactive when it comes to succession planning. So we posed the hypothetical question: would you know what to do if your executive director or board members resign tomorrow? It's sort of rhetorical, because the key point here is that your team will need to keep moving full steam ahead if an executive director, if board members were to resign individually or en masse. And you really need to be prepared for such eventualities or hypotheticals, because they do happen. What we're seeing now, more and more, we actually see a study that says estimates suggest that up to 75% of US nonprofit leaders are expecting to leave their positions in the next 5 to 10 years. So us dealing with the nonprofit sector so much, we do see an aging population in key leadership roles, and we do see a lack of proper succession planning to respond to that. Another study shows that only about 27% of nonprofits surveyed have a written formal succession plan in place. So with all this turnover that's going to come inevitably, how are people going to be able to really respond to that and not lose steam, right? So the succession planning process really composes a few key steps. First and most importantly, assessing what vacancies you're going to have to address, right? You need to create a vision for the succession plan, cultivate talent internally, look at talent externally if you have to, and then obviously, if and when you have transitions happening, properly acclimating the new individuals into the organization, making sure they're hitting the ground running. So you should develop these key plans. Really, one, you want emergency departure plans, right? In the event that people do leave and you're not planning for it. But I think most importantly, two, be proactive and have succession plans in place that are sort of on the shelf and ready. Planned departures is really what we want to focus on more than anything, is properly planning for the future. You know, you have these key roles, you have board members, you have executive directors, you have other key officers. You know that they may leave at some point in time, especially if they're aging out. You should properly plan for those departures and how they take place. Planning should occur both at the management and board levels, obviously. So that means they should be involved in the succession planning itself, but also you should be including those types of individuals in your plans in terms of who you're transitioning out. So obviously executive director is key. It may be the most important role within an organization. It's the one that can be the most chaotic if you have unexpected departures, right? So that's why you want to have those emergency plans in place. And they're the ones where if you have individuals that serve underneath the executive director, whether it's a COO or someone else, that you can properly plan for their transition. And they should be as transparent as possible in terms of what their retirement plans may be, if they're looking down the line of working X number of years, and how that can be transitioned out. There's other roles like CFO, COO, development directors, where there's usually other individuals involved in the organization that have key input and could potentially transition over into those roles over a period of time, but you want to properly plan for that. And then obviously board members too. Board members, they usually serve terms, usually know when they're up for renewal, so to speak. You should understand their intentions if they plan to continue on, and if not, have a pool of talent beneath them or aside from them that can properly step into their shoes when they're gone. Obviously, throughout this, open communication is essential, especially if you're talking about proactive planning. You need to know what the intentions and the goals of your staff and your key board members are so that you can properly plan. If someone's looking to leave very soon, obviously it's more urgent and you need to have a better plan in place. If there's a longer period of time, then you have more time to groom people. You can more effectively manage that type of transition. We recommend, and really anyone should recommend, that you form some sort of committee. You can call it a nominating governance committee, whatever you want to call it. The important point here is that this committee is in charge of shepherding these plans, making sure that they're taking place, being put into writing, being formed properly, and when you have to dust them off and use them, being executed properly. So one of the key points there is establishing job descriptions. We see this on a lot of our clients, that they still don't have job descriptions. And if they do, they may not reflect reality. So if the board, who's a little bit detached from the day-to-day operations, is trying to help with succession planning for a position or positions, they need to know what that position really is doing, right? So the way to do that is really to just speak with management, speak with key stakeholders within the organization, understand what they're doing, try to have those descriptions documented just for day-to-day operations and best practice purposes, but also, you know, for feeding the succession plan that you have in place. You want to assess turnover risk. Turnovers, it's sort of unavoidable. We've seen a lot of it in the nonprofit sector. We've seen it really all over the place. You know, as a consequence of COVID, we saw the Great Resignation, right? We see people working remotely. We see some organizations embracing that, others not. That's creating some havoc in the marketplace that we're noticing. So turnover risk is real. It's something that has to be considered. If you're dealing with people that are there, executive directors, CFOs, COOs, and the like, as I mentioned earlier, you have to have frank and honest conversations with them about how long they plan on staying. Is it a 1 to 3 year period? Is it 3 to 5? Is it 5+? And from there, you can make smart decisions about who can replace, who can be groomed, and who can eventually step into those shoes. And obviously evaluating upcoming departures. If you're aware of things that are happening and people that are leaving imminently, that has to be built into your plan as well. So the plan has to be a living, breathing document and really a concept more than that. It has to be consistently updated, consistently reviewed and refreshed to make sure that it's not stale. As the organization grows and develops and changes and new positions come on and new roles are folded into existing positions, the plan has to update for that as well. Obviously, you need a plan for emergency leadership vacancies. Those are the ones that are the most critical in terms of acute pain that can happen for an organization. An executive director suddenly leaves, suddenly retires, has disabilities, other things like that that can happen, that we've seen over the course of the time that really can screw up an organization's plans and its operations in the long term. So with an emergency departure plan, you really outline how you'll replace those key leaders as a result of these different factors that I mentioned. Here you may have to bridge gaps with interim executive directors. You may want to identify people like that. Oftentimes we see members of the board step up and fill a role for the time being until the succession plan is actually acted on, until people are found. And we'll get into that in the next slide. Establish a plan for known vacancies in nonprofit board positions. So there too, you need to assess the skills and abilities needed for these different board positions. The officers are typically the most critical, whether it's the chairperson, treasurer, secretary, vice presidents, things like that. Like I said earlier, you should have an idea of the term lengths and when people are coming up for renewal, if they want to continue on the board. If not, again, you have other board members that you can pull from. Finding board members is not the easiest concept these days. Ken alluded to that very early on. And that's a whole separate topic that we could go into. But really, another point here, can we speak more about assessing turnover risk? Well, yeah, so when you're looking at your staff, right, one good way of looking at turnover risk is what's happened in the past, right? If history is not a perfect predictor of the future, but if you've had issues in the past with retaining people, if you know that your salaries are below market, right, and you sort of have a revolving door in certain positions, that has to be built into the plan here. Organizationally, you may want to address those needs, right, and address those issues that are causing the turnover that you've had in the past. But aside from that, you want to look at where you compare to the marketplace. And if you are vulnerable in certain areas in terms of your compensation, in terms of your benefits packages, in terms of the type of work that you're doing, we work in finance. So we see a tremendous level of turnover at the controller, bookkeeper, CFO positions at nonprofit organizations. Frankly, there's a lack of talent in the field. There's fewer and fewer people going into these different discipline areas. So that's something to consider too. Is the pool of talent drying up over time because there's not as many people going into these graduate programs and things like that? That creates a vulnerability in those types of areas.
Matt, one of the things also that we see out there is when you look at organizations and you look at the management structure of different organizations, some of the larger organizations that have more developed management structures have multiple layers of management. Maybe their turnover risk might not be as significant because they have maybe middle management that has the ability potentially to be groomed and step up into a higher level management position. Some of the smaller organizations that don't necessarily have that middle level management, it might be at a higher level of risk when it comes to some of this turnover, because they don't necessarily have that middle level management that can kind of step up and take on a role if someone were to vacate. So again, I think you need to also look at your corporate structure as part of that assessment of risk to really understand how that structure is established, what resources you have within that corporate structure, and who you can kind of groom within that corporate structure to basically fill in if someone were to leave.
Yeah, and that will be covered in the next page too, where we talk about internal leadership versus external recruiting and searches and things like that. The last point on this page, and Ken, you might want to talk about this because you're more close to it. We deal with organizational life cycle changes, and one of our clients that we dealt with for a long time, the Guide Dog Foundation, they recently, a few years ago, transitioned from one type of leader to another type of leader. And Ken, you want to just briefly talk through that?
Sure. Each organization, they need as they move on through their life cycle, have to really consider what their needs are, and needs change as an organization grows and progresses and stuff like that. Guide Dog Foundation had a tremendous leader in Wells Jones who actually built the organization, helped develop structure, helped develop policy systems, a lot of the nuts and bolts sort of things. So when the current leadership, when the board was looking for current leadership, all the nuts and bolts were already done. The organization had a great infrastructure. The organization had a great processes and everything else. So they really now were in a situation where they didn't need someone who dealt with the nuts and bolts as much, because they had leadership in place that was doing that already, that, you know, Wells had kind of put in place. So really what they wanted is they were looking for someone, and John Miller is now over there, who really is important. The big important part of his job is getting the name of Guide Dog out there. It's the public relations side of things. It's the fundraising aspects of things. You know, so things change within an organization. You know, as an organization grows and develops and moves through its life cycle, the leadership that you need might be very different from the leadership that you've had. So, you know, as you're going through that whole succession plan and you're going through that whole thought process of, you know, what are you looking for in a leader? And that, as Matt mentioned before, the job responsibilities and everything else, a lot of that stuff may not be exactly what you had, and it may be what you need as opposed to what you had. So again, I think that's something that organizations need to really focus in on.
So the next page is the final one on succession planning. I need to develop a recruitment plan for boards, right? Board recruitment packets. It should have all sorts of information in there. It should spell out the responsibility of the board members, and this is the responsibility of the full board. So a lot of these bullets are sort of double meaning. Going back to recruiting, right? Identifying potential internal candidates, I think is very important, and that's something that's not happening as much as it should be. Just inherently bringing someone from the outside world to your organization involves certain risks, right? They may not fit culturally, they may not fully understand and grasp the role, and ultimately, you know, it just might not work out. We see that all the time. Internal candidates are there. They're already presumably groomed. They already understand what the organization is like. They conceivably have bought into the mission, and they're on board with all the values and ethics and things like that. So identifying potential internal candidates for succession is very important. Again, we're trying to talk about planned succession here, not the emergency type, but this works both ways. If there's emergency succession, you have people that are sort of in-house that could step into those shoes. That's something that you really want to consider more than anything. But in order to do that, you have to single these people out, right? Not everyone is a potential leader. Not everyone can step up. Not everyone can elevate. Not everybody wants to. So it's very important to speak with these individuals that you have identified as potential replacements and potential successors to departing individuals, right? Make sure that they're on board with the plan. Make sure that they are interested in succeeding and in elevating and stepping up when that time comes, either in an emergency or if it's planned out over X number of years of time. So if you are identifying these people and they are looking and on the same plane as you, then is there training that's needed? Is there soft skills that they need? Are there other parts of the role that's lying before them that they need to understand or start to get their feet wet in or their hands dirty with, to make sure that they can best move forward and, you know, step into those shoes, as I keep saying. Identifying external candidates is obviously very important too. So as much as you want to just have everyone work internally and move up and elevate, it's implausible sometimes. And sometimes you want a fresh perspective, right? You want to shake things up. You want an outside view of your organization and someone that brings a different level of experience or different type of experience from their past lives. So here, what we see oftentimes is recruiting firms get involved. It's a small community when you think about it, but there's a lot of nonprofits out there. There's a lot of nonprofit professionals. They tend to swim in circles. So boards and organizations that are well connected that get involved in network, they know potential candidates, but still, there's definite value in hiring consultants, getting recruiting firms involved, and having a search, you know, a 3 to 6 month process to find somebody, properly vet them, and then obviously try to integrate them into the culture and into the environment that you have. In the meantime here, what you have in certain emergency situations is you may have an interim leader, right? So the interim leader is just trying to keep you afloat, keep the organization moving forward, not trying to shake things up, but trying to keep programs running, finances, you know, in a solid position for that 3 to 6 month period of time while you're looking for that candidate. And as you're doing that, again, remember, we're talking about having a recruiting committee, right? A nominating governance committee of the board with individuals from management involved with vetting these potential candidates, with interviewing them, with making sure that they understand what it is they're stepping into, providing those candidates with the job description, and having those discussions that Ken mentioned about maybe there's an evolving role of the organization or the role that they're sitting in and trying to take over, that has to be factored in, like Guide Dog, right? You don't want it to be exactly the same as it was. The organization is looking to move in a new direction, and you have to be very transparent and clear And to go back to the first page, communication and open communication between everyone involved is very important, because sometimes we do see where organizations hire a new, let's say, executive director who has certain assumptions about the role and position, and it turns out in reality they're different. And then there's chaos and havoc for 3 to 6 months. And then there's another search that happens when that person leaves or is terminated. So you want to avoid that, because it is chaotic. It does cost time. It does cost money. It's not a pleasant process to try to replace somebody in an emergency. That's why we recommend more than anything that organizations should really think about this carefully, start to consider the different factors that we've laid out, put together some sort of succession plan to make sure that they're not caught off guard. And the final step here, establishing a plan for orientation and onboarding. It's not like you hire somebody and poof, they're suddenly running with the rest of your team, right? They need to understand, they need to get involved. They may need training. They may need support from the people above and below them and beside them. So it doesn't stop when you make the hire, right? That person still has to be groomed, and it takes time. It takes probably a good 6 months to a year for someone to really get fully assimilated into the organization and to operate at a very effective level.
One of the other things that we see also is a lot of times if you have an executive director that is retiring and you bring on a new executive director, sometimes the tendency is to have that retiring executive director stay on with some level of involvement within the organization, maybe as a board member and stuff. You have to be careful with respect to having that board member that old executive director join the board. The reason that that's important is because you don't want to have the new executive director in the shadows of the old executive director. You don't want to have them kind of second guessing the decisions they're making because other people are saying, well, that's not the way the old executive director did it and stuff. And the old executive director is there to remind everybody. So just be a little careful in terms of that succession plan, in terms of, if the retiring executive director is going to stay involved with the organization, just be careful and understand that it could have an impact overall with respect to the organization. So the last thing that we want to talk about today is managing risk. And again, I think this is kind of goes hand in hand with the whole aspect of strategic thinking and everything else. Because when you're thinking about strategic risk, strategic thinking, succession planning, everything, there's always risk. I mean, there's risk in succession planning of turnover. There's risk of fraud. There's risk of all sorts of issues. So, every organization focuses a myriad of risks, right? So you should identify and assess risk and develop a plan to mitigate risk, right? That's one of the things and part of that whole planning process. Risk assessment is an ongoing, process, and things can occur and change organizational risk over time. So you also have to kind of factor in the fact that organizational risk isn't static. It's going to change as things move on. And risk happens both internally and externally. There are external factors that drive increased risk, and there are internal factors. So there are a couple things that I kind of want to go over here with respect to risk. So a few things to kind of consider, things like control environment, right? So if you have a strong control environment and you have good segregation of duties, good compensating controls, oversight, review, and everything else, the board is involved in reviewing some of the fiscal picture through budget to actual and everything else, you start to reduce your risk of error and fraud, and that's important. I mean, if you have, obviously nothing can derail an organization like fraud. You have fraud coming in, that could have a significant issue. If you're in a situation where there's errors being made within the financial statements or financial information, or within the organization, that creates all sorts of problems. I mean, if you're not updating your infrastructure on a regular basis, you're not updating, doing proper repairs and maintenance, you could have a lot of injuries that result in workers' comp cases or justice center reportings and things like that. So, it's really important to kind of keep track of that. Staffing, Matt already mentioned, turnover is a very important factor, not just at the leadership level, but throughout the organization everywhere. So, you have to make sure that you have the ability to bring on staff, that the staff are competent, that the staff are well-trained. And again, that helps to reduce risk. The economy is a big issue. Right now, we have an economic downturn that's happened. We expect that the economic downturn is going to continue through at least 2023 and who knows into 2024. That increases inflation, interest, demand for services, and it's having a cutback in the ability for your organization to raise funds. So if you have inadequate funds, you may not be able to meet your budget, may not be able to deliver services. So all of these things kind of come into play. Then on top of that, you have regulations. There are changing regulations, there are changing reimbursement methodologies and everything else. All of these things have to come into play in terms of understanding what could potentially happen that you're going to need to do something to or do something with in order to kind of stay abreast of or change. Who's doing reviewing changes and regulations within your organization? How is that review process getting up to the board level so the board understands some of the regulatory changes and maybe can set appropriate policy and with respect to some of this? Insurance is a big risk area, right? Is there adequate insurance coverage in place? We were talking to an insurance broker who came in to look at one of our clients, and he was looking at vehicle coverage that existed at this client. And one of the things he realized is that, the client had $1 million worth of vehicle coverage, which sounds in and of itself not bad. All right, we got $1 million, but the organization has works with the developmentally disabled population. They have buses, mini buses that they own, that they transport individuals, and you can have 8 to 10 individuals on a bus at a time. When you look at it through that lens, maybe $1 million worth of coverage isn't enough. So you really have to kind of look at the different levels of insurance, understand how that insurance kind of interplays with the operations of the organization. Even things like cybersecurity. If you're not doing all of the proper, or you don't have all the proper controls and technology in place with respect to your IT environment, you could have cybersecurity insurance, but it's not going to pay out anything because a lot of the cyber coverage these days require certain protocols, and authentications and things like that to occur. And if those things aren't happening, there's going to be limited coverage within your cybersecurity policy. So there's a lot of risk there. Conflicts of interest and related party transactions. Do you have in place good policies and disclosure? Are you vetting the transactions to make sure they're appropriate for the organization? Are they at fair market value? Is the individual who has the conflict, are they recused from the discussion and voting component of things? What does your grant compliance look like and monitoring? Who's doing the grant compliance and monitoring within the organization? How do we know that all of the reporting is done on time and appropriately? We're talking to an organization right now that has until December 31st to get all of their vouchering in, otherwise they lose their funding. Here we are, 3 weeks away from the end of the year, and they lost a key individual within the organization. If they can't get someone in to do the work, they stand to lose a big chunk of their funding for the year. So again, what are the risks in place? Do you have redundancy within certain positions so that there are multiple people who can kind of fill in if there's a need there? Medicaid compliance is a big area. You have the Office of the Medicaid Inspector General who's coming in and doing audits of many Medicaid funded organizations. Organizations that receive Medicaid funding are required to have a Medicaid compliance officer if their funding is over $500,000. They should be doing formalized risk assessments and testing. They should have audit protocols in place. So all of these things are things that you need to be looking at. And this is all information that should be happening at some level of a committee structure level. So whether there's a compliance committee or risk committee or whatever, that kind of looks at all of this stuff. And this should be getting or finding its way up to the board so that the board really understands, and there should be some sort of regular communication at the board level with respect to risk. As I mentioned, there are government audits taking place on a regular basis. I mean, we're seeing it over and over again in terms of, on a regular basis, there are reports being issued by the Office of the Medicaid Inspector General or the Office of the State Controller, where these reports are being issued. You want to be looking at those reports. You want to be reading those reports, or have someone within the organization who's doing that, in order to really understand the direction that the regulators and that the auditors are looking at. So if you're seeing a trend in things that they're looking at and the types of agencies they're going after, and you're in that industry, you better go back and look at your procedures and make sure that you're covering everything and that the right documentation, everything is there. Most of your funding sources, where there are audit steps that are going to come in, whether it be the OMIG or the OSC, there are audit protocols in place. They've published them. They're on their website. You should have someone within your organization going and downloading those audit protocols and reviewing the audit protocols, and maybe doing some internal audit procedures to really gain an understanding that the audit protocols are being followed. Cybersecurity, I mentioned it before, but it's a big issue. And it's a big issue, especially within the nonprofit sector, because the nonprofit sector, I don't want to say they're not taking it seriously, but there's a lot of holes. Only 26% of nonprofits actively monitor their network environment. So if you're not monitoring what's happening within the network environment, there could be people trying to break in. 59% of nonprofits do not provide cybersecurity training to their staff. Every organization at this point should be having some level of cybersecurity training for their staff. And only 20% of nonprofits have a policy in place to address cyber attacks. So if you have a cyber attack, what do you do? What's the process? Do you have proper backups so that a cyber attack is lessened because you have the ability to restore information? So again, cybersecurity is a big issue within the nonprofit sector. It's something that definitely should be looked at, and it's something that organizations need to focus some time on from a risk perspective. As I mentioned before, there are changing regulations. There are constantly new reimbursement methodologies or new regulations that are coming. During COVID, I mean, it seemed like there was a new regulation posted every day. There are new funding streams that are coming out. You have the healthcare worker bonus. You have ERTC, the Employee Retention Tax Credit, is still a thing. How is the organization tracking all of these things? How are they staying on top and knowing what those changing regulations are? There are a lot of trade associations. Which trade associations does your organization belong to? And again, how is that information getting into the organization and up to the board so the board understands? You have laws that are in place, like the Nonprofit Revitalization Act and NITMIFA. How do you know whether you're following those laws? We're starting to see more and more where boards are retaining attorneys and other board coaches to be able to provide some level of governance support, because governance is such a big thing and it's a big risk of organizations. From a donation perspective, organizations are bringing in restricted donations. How are you ensuring that those restrictions are being met? If I've got endowments, how am I ensuring that my endowments are being properly safeguarded and that we're holding on to the assets, or we're making a board decision whether we're going to appropriate funds or utilize those funds during the course of the year. Appropriate to utilize them during the year, or accumulate them for ongoing growth. Lobbying and political activity. Everybody knows that nonprofits can't have any sort of political activity, but there are also penalties and stuff associated with excess lobbying. Employment-related issues. There are lawsuits. There are workers' comp claims. There's turnover. All of these things, come into play, and you need to kind of evaluate what management is doing in order to protect the organization. And then even with respect to something like collaborations, we spent a bunch of time talking earlier about collaborations, but if you're entering into collaborations with partners, that's opening the organization up to a certain level of risk too. What do those partnerships look like? What does the agreement call for? What happens if one of your collaborative partners does something wrong? How does that impact you? Who are you collaborating with, and are they a good partner? What does their reputation look like? And if there was a problem, what happens? as part of that whole risk management process, you have to ensure that the board is being addressed regularly and information is being reported back to the board. And as I said before, we're big proponents of having a compliance committee or have risk fall under the auspices of the audit committee. So you want to also make sure that, that there's a committee who's kind of handling the review. The board can't look at all aspects of everything. The board meetings would go on forever, but there really should be a good either, like I said, compliance committee or audit committee that's really focusing on a lot of these risk areas and are able to kind of streamline them and maybe put together like a risk scorecard, like we talked about earlier with the the strategic planning scorecard, but maybe some sort of risk scorecard so that we can track where the risks are and what we're doing as an organization to mitigate those risks. Also, because IT is so prevalent within every single organization, I think you also need to focus on things from an IT perspective and really beef up and have some sort of IT committee that's kind of looking at the risks associated with the organization's IT environment, especially with a lot of people now working remotely. That opens up new risks that we never had before. What sort of patches are we putting in place and everything else? And then you also need to ensure that you have the proper expertise, whether that's in-house, whether you have someone on your board who can kind of discuss some of these issues, whether they be IT, insurance, fiscal, any of those types of issues. Or if you don't have someone internally, you may want to think about maybe outsourcing some of the responsibility so that you can work towards mitigating risk. We are running out of time, so just a couple things real quick. There are a couple guides that we have on our website. If you go and look, we have the Nonprofit Guide to Effective Board Membership, which is a guide that you can kind of download, and it gives a whole bunch of information. It's really a good tool to give to new board members. The IT guidebook is a collaborative guide that was put together with other professionals that really talks a lot about cybersecurity issues and insurance and all that stuff. So again, if you do have that IT committee, that's a good place, a good tool for them. If you need to, or if you have questions, you want to reach out to us, you can reach out to us, any one of us. Feel free, we're here to answer questions that you may have. Finally, don't forget to register for our next session, which is occurring January 19th. It's going to be part 3 of the process. So we hope to see you there. Hope everybody has a great holiday season, and thanks for being part of this. So long, everyone.